Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Nautilus Explorer as it gently rocked in the crystalline waters of the Bermuda Triangle. Dr. Katherine Reynolds stood at the ship's bow, her weathered hands gripping the railing as she gazed into the endless expanse of blue before her. 20 years of deep sea exploration had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now every fibre of her being screamed that something was different about these waters. The research vessel had been stationed in the area for 3 weeks, following a series of unprecedented sonar readings that defied explanation. As lead oceanographer for NASA's Deep Sea Anomaly research division, Katherine had seen her share of unusual phenomena, but nothing like this. "Dr. Reynolds!" The call came from behind her, urgent and breathless. Thomas Wright, one of her youngest researchers, came running across the deck, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. The readings. They're off the charts." Katherine followed him to the ship's main research lab, where dozens of monitors displayed real-time data from their deep sea sensors. The central screen showed a three-dimensional mapping of the ocean floor, but what caught her attention was the massive dark spot at 3,000 feet below the surface. It was perfectly still, unlike any natural formation she'd ever encountered. "Have we tried the new imaging equipment?" she asked, leaning closer to the screen. "Yes, but..." Thomas hesitated, his usual enthusiasm dampened by obvious concern. "Every time we try to get a clear picture, our equipment malfunctions. It's like something down there is interfering with the signals." Katherine had dealt with equipment failures before. The extreme pressures and conditions of the deep ocean were notoriously harsh on technology, but this was different. The failures were too consistent, too precise, as if something was actively preventing them from seeing what lay beneath. "Prep the deep seeker," she ordered, referring to their prototype submersible. "If we can't get clear readings from here, we'll have to get closer." The deep seeker was NASA's pride and joy, a revolutionary submersible designed to withstand pressures that would crush conventional vessels. Its sleek titanium hull housed the most advanced sensing and imaging technology ever developed for deep sea exploration. If anything could get close enough to document what lay below, it was this machine. As the crew prepared the submersible, Katherine noticed something odd about the water around the ship. Despite the calm weather, small whirlpools were forming and dissipating at random intervals, like invisible fingers stirring the ocean's surface. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The launch sequence took nearly 2 hours. Katherine watched from the control room as the deep seeker disappeared beneath the waves, its powerful lights piercing the growing darkness. The submersible's cameras transmitted crystal clear footage to the bank of monitors before her, showing the gradual descent through layers of increasingly dark water. At 1,000 feet, they encountered the first anomaly. The water temperature dropped suddenly, far below what was normal for this depth. At 2,000 feet, the submersible's external sensors detected a low-frequency humming sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was unlike anything in their database of ocean sounds. Not biological, not geological, not mechanical. Then, at 2,800 feet, they saw it. The deep seeker's lights illuminated something that shouldn't exist, rising from the ocean floor like a monument from a civilization that never should have been, was a structure that defied comprehension. Its surface was black, but not the dull black of stone or metal. This was a black that seemed to swallow light itself, yet somehow reflected it in ways that made the eyes hurt to look at it. "My God," Thomas whispered beside her. What are we looking at? The structure was massive, its full size impossible to determine as it disappeared into the murky depths beyond the submersible's lights. Its surface was covered in markings that seemed to shift and change whenever the cameras focused on them for too long. But most disturbing was the way it seemed to pulse, like something breathing in slow motion. Katherine ordered the deep seeker to circle the structure, documenting every angle they could manage. As they did, the humming sound grew stronger, resonating through the ship's hull and setting everyone's teeth on edge. Several crew members complained of sudden, intense headaches. Then, the communication system crackled to life with a sound that made Katherine's blood run cold. Beneath the standard static and interference was something else. A whisper that seemed to contain countless voices speaking in languages that had never been heard by human ears. The deep seeker's instruments began to fail one by one. First the external temperature sensors, then the depth gauges, then the sonar. But the cameras continued to transmit, showing them something that would haunt Katherine's dreams for years to come. As the submersible made one final pass around the structure, its lights illuminated what appeared to be an opening, a doorway or portal that hadn't been there moments before. And in that opening, something moved. Something vast and dark and ancient, stirring from what might have been an eons-long slumber. Katherine's hand slammed down on the emergency recall button, just as the last camera failed, plunging the control room into silence. The deep seeker returned to the surface on automatic protocols, but the damage was done. They had seen something they were never meant to see, and in doing so, they had awakened something that should have remained forever dormant. As the crew rushed to retrieve the submersible, Katherine stood motionless before the blank monitors, her mind struggling to process what they had witnessed. In all her years of scientific research, she had never encountered anything that defied explanation quite like this. But deep in her gut, she knew this was only the beginning. The Nautilus Explorer's instruments recorded a significant temperature drop in the surrounding waters that night, and several crew members reported hearing strange whispers in their dreams. Something had changed in the Bermuda Triangle, and as Katherine would soon discover, there would be no going back to the world they knew before. Within 48 hours of the discovery, NASA had established a research base on a private island just outside the affected zone. The facility, hastily constructed but equipped with cutting-edge technology, hummed with activity as specialists from around the world arrived to study the mysterious structure. Dr. Michael Blackwood arrived on a rainy Sunday morning, his expertise in ancient civilizations and forgotten languages making him an invaluable addition to the team. As he stepped off the helicopter, he was struck by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the island like a shroud. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and carried a metallic taste that made him think of old pennies. "Dr. Blackwood," Katherine greeted him, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We've got something you need to see." She led him through the facility to a secure room where dozens of screens displayed footage from the deep seeker's encounter with the structure. But what caught Michael's attention were the walls, covered in printouts of the strange markings found on the artifact's surface. "These symbols," he muttered, moving closer to examine them. "They're unlike anything I've ever seen. They seem to incorporate elements from various ancient writing systems, but the patterns, they're wrong somehow, as if they were written by something that didn't quite understand how human language should work." Dr. Rebecca Torres, the team's lead researcher, joined them with a stack of papers clutched to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she spread them across the table. "The symbols aren't static," she explained. "Watch." She played a time-lapse video showing how the markings on the structure's surface seemed to shift and change over time, like living things writhing beneath the surface of the water. Michael felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the patterns transform into configurations that seemed to hurt his eyes when he tried to focus on them. James Henderson, their deep-sea exploration specialist, burst into the room with urgent news. Another vessel had disappeared in the triangle, but this time they had recovered something, an ancient logbook, its pages barely held together by rotting leather bindings. The logbook belonged to a Portuguese merchant vessel that had vanished in 1752. Most of the pages were illegible, destroyed by centuries underwater, but a few passages remained clear enough to read. Michael spent hours translating them, his face growing paler with each page. "Listen to this," he said, his voice hoarse. "The door beneath the waves calls to us in our dreams. The captain speaks of voices in his head, telling him to sail deeper into the triangle. 3 men jumped overboard last night, swimming towards something only they could see. God help us, for we have strayed too close to something that was meant to stay hidden." As Michael read the passage aloud, the lights in the room flickered, and several researchers reported hearing a faint whisper just at the edge of their hearing. Dr. Torres dropped her coffee mug, sending dark liquid spreading across the floor like an omen. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Equipment continued to malfunction in unusual ways. Computers would turn themselves on in the middle of the night, screens filling with strings of incomprehensible symbols, similar to those found on the structure. Team members began reporting increasingly disturbing dreams, visions of vast, dark spaces and something moving in the depths. Katherine found herself working late one night, reviewing footage from the Deep Seeker's cameras for the 100th time. As she watched, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In one frame, barely visible in the darkness beyond the submersible's lights, something had moved. She paused the video, enhanced the image, and felt her heart stop. There, in the grainy footage, was what appeared to be a massive eye, gazing directly into the camera. But it wasn't any kind of eye she had ever seen before. Its pupils seemed to contain swirling patterns that matched the symbols on the structure's surface. She was about to call for the others when the power in the facility failed completely. In the pitch darkness, she heard something that would haunt her forever. The same haunting hum they had detected near the structure, but this time it was coming from inside the building. When emergency power came on 30 seconds later, every screen in the facility displayed the same image, a perfect replica of one of the symbols from the structure. And as the team watched in horror, it began to move, pulsing like a heartbeat, as if something was trying to push its way through the screens into our world. Dr. Torres was the first to notice that the weather had changed dramatically. Despite the clear forecast, a massive storm had formed directly over the island. The clouds swirled in unnatural patterns, and lighting flashed in colours that shouldn't exist in nature. The ocean around the island had turned black as ink, and the waves seemed to move against the wind, as if being pulled by some unseen force. In the command centre, the radar system picked up dozens of anomalies appearing and disappearing around the island. Each one corresponded exactly to the location of historical disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, as if history was repeating itself all at once. James Henderson, monitoring the deep-sea sensors, detected something that made his blood run cold. The structure was moving, not shifting or sliding, but expanding, growing like some kind of mechanical cancer beneath the waves. And as it grew, the humming sound grew stronger, resonating at a frequency that made people's vision blur and their thoughts turn strange. As the team scrambled to document and understand these phenomena, none of them noticed the water in their glasses beginning to vibrate, forming tiny patterns that matched the symbols on the structure. None of them saw the shadows in the corners of the room growing deeper, taking on shapes that shouldn't be possible. And none of them realized that, with each passing moment, the barrier between their world and whatever lay beyond the structure was growing thinner. The investigation had begun, but it was rapidly becoming clear that they were dealing with something far beyond their ability to control. or comprehend. Something ancient and patient that had been waiting countless millennia for someone to find it, and now that they had, it had no intention of remaining hidden any longer. The first person to break was Dr. Andre Phillips, a seasoned marine biologist who had spent decades studying deep-sea life forms. They found him in the early hours of the morning, huddled in a corner of his lab, surrounded by hundreds of drawings. Each sketch showed the same thing: vast, otherworldly shapes moving through darkness, with too many limbs and eyes that seemed to stare out from the paper. "They're coming through," he whispered when Katherine tried to help him up. "Every time we look at it, every time we think about it, we create tiny cracks, and they're using those cracks to pull themselves into our world." Within hours, Dr. Phillips was evacuated to the mainland, but his warnings echoed in Katherine's mind as she reviewed the latest data from their monitoring stations. The anomalies around the structure were intensifying. The water temperature continued to drop, reaching levels that should have been physically impossible. Marine life had completely abandoned the area, creating a dead zone that grew larger with each passing day. James Henderson led another expedition to the structure, this time with 3 submersibles working in tandem. The vessels were equipped with enhanced cameras and sensing equipment, designed to penetrate the strange interference that surrounded the artifact. But as they descended into the darkness, something went terribly wrong. The radio transmission started normally, with each crew reporting their observations. Then, the voices began to change. Words became jumbled, languages mixed together in impossible ways. The final transmission from the lead submersible contained sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. Only one vessel returned to the surface. Its exterior was covered in strange marks, as if something with enormous claws had tried to tear through the reinforced hull. The crew was alive but unresponsive, their eyes open but seeing nothing, their mouths moving in silent conversations with invisible entities. The retrieved video footage showed something that defied explanation. As the submersibles approached the structure, the water around them began to move in ways that violated the laws of physics. Currents flowed in multiple directions simultaneously, creating impossible patterns that hurt the mind to look at. Then, the cameras captured glimpses of something moving in the darkness, vast shapes that seemed to fold through dimensions that shouldn't exist. Dr. Torres, analyzing the footage, frame by frame, made a terrifying discovery. In the background of several shots, barely visible in the gloom, were the missing submersibles from previous expeditions, but they appeared to be melting, their metal hulls flowing like wax as they were absorbed into the structure's surface. And inside one of them, a human figure was still visible, moving in ways that no human body should be able to move. The night after this discovery, every member of the research team experienced the same dream. They found themselves floating in an endless void, surrounded by points of light that might have been stars, except they pulsed with an organic rhythm. In the dream, they could hear singing, beautiful but wrong, like a beloved melody played in a key that shouldn't exist. When they awoke, they discovered that everyone had drawn the same symbol on their walls while sleeping. It matched none of the markings they had documented on the structure, but looking at it filled them with a deep, primordial dread. Katherine ordered a complete lockdown of the facility. No one was to approach the structure without direct authorization, and all communication with the outside world would be strictly monitored. But it was already too late. The entity's influence had taken root in their minds, planting seeds of madness that were beginning to sprout. Dr. Blackwood, still working to decipher the symbols, began experiencing fugue states. He would come to his senses hours later to find his notes filled with writings in languages that had never existed on Earth. The writings described things that made him wake up screaming, visions of cities built in geometries that defied Euclidean space, and beings whose very existence threatened the fabric of reality. The weather continued to deteriorate. The storm that had formed over the island now appeared to be rotating around the structure's location, creating a permanent vortex that defied all meteorological explanation. Aircraft reported seeing strange lights within the clouds, and pilots who flew too close to the area reported hearing voices giving them coordinates in unknown languages. One morning, the team awoke to find that the ocean had turned mirror smooth despite the raging storm above. The surface reflected not the sky, but something else. Vast cityscapes that couldn't exist, illuminated by light sources that cast multiple shadows in impossible directions. Those who stared too long at the reflections began to bleed from their eyes. The structure itself had changed. The deep-sea sensors showed that it was no longer simply growing, but transforming. Its surface rippled and flowed like liquid metal, forming new patterns and configurations that seemed to serve some incomprehensible purpose. The humming sound it produced had developed harmonics that resonated with human brainwaves, causing those who heard it to experience vivid hallucinations of other worlds and other times. In her private quarters, Katherine reviewed all the data they had gathered, trying to understand what they were dealing with. The pieces were there, but every time she got close to seeing the full picture, her mind shied away, as if some primitive part of her brain was protecting her from a truth too terrible to comprehend. It was Dr. Torres who finally made the connection. The structure wasn't just a prison or a door. It was both, and neither. It was a boundary point, a place where the membrane between realities had grown thin. The entity they had detected wasn't trying to break free. It was trying to break through, to tear down the walls between dimensions and let something even worse enter our universe. As if in response to this realization, all the lights in the facility began to pulse in rhythm with the structure's humming. In the darkness between each pulse, the team caught glimpses of things moving through the shadows, things that disappeared when directly observed, but left behind trails of frost and the lingering scent of ozone. The descent into horror had begun, and there was no way back up. They had awakened something that had been sleeping since before the Earth was born, and its dreams were beginning to become reality. As Katherine stared out her window at the writhing storm above, she realized that humanity's understanding of the universe had been nothing but a comforting lie. The truth was far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The end began on a moonless night when the storms above the facility briefly parted to reveal a sky devoid of stars. Not covered by clouds, simply empty, as if that part of the universe had been erased. The anomaly lasted only 6 minutes, but in that time, every electronic device on the island recorded the same sequence of pulses emanating from the structure below. "It's a signal," Dr. Torres announced, her voice trembling as she analysed the data. "But it's not being transmitted outward. It's being broadcast inward, towards the centre of the Earth." The response came 3 hours later. The entire facility shook as something deep beneath the ocean floor began to move. Seismic sensors registered activity at depths far beyond the planet's crust, in places where nothing should be able to exist. The structure had begun to resonate at a frequency that made the air itself vibrate, and people's thoughts began to slip sideways into impossible geometries. Katherine found James Henderson in the monitoring room staring at the live feed from their few remaining underwater cameras. The structure's surface had become transparent, revealing something moving inside. Vast shapes that seemed to fold through space in ways that the human mind couldn't process. But it was the voices that broke him. "They're singing," he whispered, tears of blood running down his face. "They're singing about what comes next, about what they're going to do to our world, to every world, to time itself." The facility's psychologist, Dr. Nina Patel, reported that patients were experiencing shared hallucinations, visions of vast underwater cities that had never existed on Earth, populated by beings that moved in and out of reality, like swimmers breaking the surface of a pool. But they weren't hallucinations. The barrier between dimensions was breaking down, and memories of things that had never happened were bleeding into the present. In her quarters, Katherine found her mirror had turned liquid, its surface rippling with images from other times and places. She saw herself in 1,000 different realities, some where humanity had never evolved, others where Earth had given birth to things far older and stranger than mammals. In every reflection, something vast and dark was reaching through, pulling the different realities together like a hand, crushing aluminum cans. The structure's transformation accelerated. Its surface began to rotate in multiple directions simultaneously, creating patterns that induced seizures in anyone who looked at them directly. The sea around it turned viscous, thick with things that might have been tentacles or might have been branches of possibility, reaching upward toward the surface. Dr. Blackwood made one final breakthrough in decoding the symbols, but the knowledge drove him to take desperate action. They found him in the communications room, surrounded by broken equipment, using his own blood to paint warnings on the walls. It's not just one entity, Katherine deciphered from his writings. The structure was built to contain a whole civilization, beings that existed before the universe had fully formed, when the laws of physics were still soft and malleable. They've been waiting, dreaming, planning, and now they're going to remake everything. The ocean began to boil, not with heat but with motion, as if something massive was stirring beneath the waves. The dead zone around the facility expanded rapidly, and satellite imagery showed a perfect circle of emptiness spreading across the Bermuda Triangle, centered on the structure's location. Ships and aircraft that strayed into the zone simply ceased to exist, disappearing between one moment and the next. Then the screaming began, not from human throats but from reality itself, a vast grinding sound like continental plates shifting, but modulated into something that might have been language. Dr. Torres's instruments registered it as a repeating pattern that matched the structure's original markings. She worked frantically to decode it, even as blood ran from her ears. "It's coordinates," she gasped, staring at her readings in horror. "Not in space, in reality. They're mapping the weak points between dimensions, planning their emergence points. This isn't just an invasion. They're going to hatch our universe like an egg." The structure's humming reached a crescendo that shattered every piece of glass in the facility. In the absolute silence that followed, something impossible happened. The water around the facility began to flow upward, defying gravity, forming a tower of liquid that stretched towards the starless void above. Within the water, shadows moved with terrible purpose. Katherine ordered an immediate evacuation, but it was already too late. The entity's influence had spread too far, affecting not just minds but the fundamental forces that held reality together. Some of the helicopters that attempted to leave found themselves flying through skies filled with impossible colors, emerging into versions of Earth that had never existed. Others simply vanished, their radio transmissions ending in bursts of sound that caused listeners to experience memories that hadn't happened yet. In the final hours, as the facility's systems failed one by one, Katherine made her way to the highest point of the building. The view that greeted her was beyond description. The ocean had turned into a vast, moving thing that no longer behaved like water. The sky above had split open, revealing spaces between spaces filled with things that had been waiting since before time began. The structure itself had transformed into something that hurt the mind to look at, a vast, shifting mass that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, each form more impossible than the last. And from its depths came the entity, finally revealing itself to the world it had waited so long to reach. What emerged wasn't a single being, but an endless progression of forms, each one containing universes of horror within itself. They rose from the depths like a tide of nightmares given flesh, their very presence warping the laws of physics and sanity around them. The air filled with colours that had no names, and sounds that carried meanings that no human mind was meant to comprehend. Katherine's last act was to activate the facility's emergency beacon, broadcasting a warning to the outside world. But as she watched the entity continue its emergence, she realised that there might not be an outside world much longer. The boundaries between realities were collapsing, and through the cracks poured things that had been old when the first stars were young. The Bermuda Triangle had kept its secret for millennia, but now that secret was free. And as the entity's influence spread across the earth, humanity would learn that there are far worse things than death. There are the spaces between spaces where the old ones dream their dark dreams of reality unmade. 3 months after the incident at the research facility, the world had changed in ways that few dared to acknowledge openly. The official story, released by a hastily assembled coalition of government agencies, blamed the events in the Bermuda Triangle on a series of natural phenomena. They spoke of unusual weather patterns, underwater gas releases, and magnetic anomalies. But those who knew the truth could see the changes spreading like cracks in a pane of glass. The Bermuda Triangle had become something else entirely, a wound in reality that continued to widen. The ocean within its boundaries no longer reflected the sky, instead showing glimpses of other places, other times, other possibilities. Ships that passed through its waters reported seeing things swimming in impossible depths, their forms visible only as vast shadows that moved in ways that violated natural law. The nightmares began spreading globally. People in cities thousands of miles from the triangle started experiencing the same dreams. Visions of vast underwater cities where the entity's children were growing, preparing, waiting. Some dreamers spoke of seeing Katherine Reynolds, still alive somehow, wandering through these alien landscapes with blood-filled eyes, leaving warnings written in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Dr. Torres was found 2 weeks after the evacuation, floating in a small boat off the coast of Florida. Her skin had turned translucent, and her notebook contained detailed descriptions of places that couldn't exist. Before she vanished again, she told her rescuers that the entity hadn't simply escaped. It had transformed the structure into a breeding ground, a place where it could create more of its kind. The changes were subtle at first. People reported seeing colours that shouldn't exist, appearing at the edges of their vision. Electronic devices began picking up transmissions from nowhere, fragments of conversations that hadn't happened yet, or had happened in realities that no longer existed. Children born after the incident sometimes displayed strange abilities, their minds operating according to laws of physics that hadn't been valid in our universe before the entity's emergence. James Henderson emerged from his coma in a military hospital, his mind somehow intact despite everything he had witnessed. His testimony, recorded over several days, provided the first coherent explanation of what the entity truly was. It wasn't just a being from another dimension. It was a living bridge between realities, a creature that existed simultaneously in countless universes. And now it was using our world as a gateway to connect them all. The disappearances continued, but they had changed in nature. Instead of vessels simply vanishing, they would sometimes return, days, weeks, or months later, transformed in subtle ways. A cruise ship reappeared with all its passengers still aboard, but their reflections moved independently of their bodies. A cargo plane landed safely after being missing for 3 weeks, its crew unharmed but speaking in tongues that caused plants to grow in impossible patterns. Dr. Blackwood's final notes, recovered from the ruins of the facility, spoke of a terrible possibility. The entity wasn't simply invading our reality, it was converting it, gradually transforming our universe into something that more closely resembled its native realm. Each disappearance, each strange event, each inexplicable phenomenon was another step in this process of cosmic terraforming. The world's oceans began to change. Deep-sea researchers reported vast structures growing in the darkest trenches, their architecture following patterns that matched the original artifact symbols. Marine life started exhibiting impossible mutations, giving birth to things that seemed to exist partially in other dimensions. The depths became places where reality was thin, where the laws of physics were more like suggestions than rules. Katherine's warning, broadcast in those final moments, continued to circulate through hidden channels on the internet. Those who listened to it in its entirety reported experiencing visions of the future, not just one future, but many, all overlapping like pages in a book, viewed through water. In each of these potential futures, they saw the same thing: the entity's influence spreading, reality unraveling, the boundaries between dimensions dissolving like sugar in rain. The research facility itself became a legend, its location hidden beneath waves that no longer behaved like normal water. Satellite photos showed a permanent storm system centered on its location, but the clouds moved in patterns that meteorologists couldn't explain, forming shapes that resembled the symbols from the structure. Some nights, when the stars aligned in certain configurations, people reported seeing lights beneath the ocean's surface, spreading outward from the triangle like veins of luminescence. Those who watched them for too long began to understand things they were never meant to know. Secrets about the nature of reality, about the true history of our universe, about the beings that had existed in the spaces between spaces since before time began. The entity's children were growing stronger. Each day brought new reports of impossible events, of reality bending in ways that defied explanation. The world's governments maintained their facade of normalcy, but behind closed doors, they knew the truth. The change couldn't be stopped. The entity hadn't just escaped its prison. It had turned our entire universe into its new home, and it was redecorating. In the end, Katherine's final message proved prophetic. The old world, the world of solid facts and unchangeable laws, was dying. In its place, something new was being born, a reality where the impossible was commonplace, where the spaces between spaces were as real as solid ground, where humanity would have to learn to survive in a universe that no longer played by the rules they understood. The Bermuda Triangle had become more than just a place where things disappeared. It was now a reminder of humanity's true place in the cosmos, not as masters of their domain, but as tiny creatures living in the shadow of beings so vast and incomprehensible that merely acknowledging their existence was enough to drive one mad. And somewhere, in the depths of the transformed ocean, the entity continued its work, reshaping reality one impossibility at a time. Its ancient dreams of chaos and change finally made manifest in our world. The door beneath the waves had been opened, and there was no way to close it again. The old laws of physics were being rewritten. The boundaries between dimensions were dissolving, and humanity could only watch as their universe was transformed into something that more closely resembled the entity's true home. In the years that followed, people learned to live with the changes, adapting as best they could to a world where reality itself could no longer be trusted. But on quiet nights, when the stars shone with colors that had no names, they remembered the warning that had started it all. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some secrets, once unveiled, can never be forgotten. The Bermuda Triangle's greatest mystery had finally been solved, but the price of that knowledge was the transformation of our entire reality. And in the depths of the altered ocean, the entity's children continued to grow, preparing for the day when the last barriers between dimensions would fall, and all of existence would become one vast, interconnected realm of chaos and wonder. Those who knew the truth could only hope that humanity would be ready for that day when it came. But deep down they knew that nothing could truly prepare them for the world that was coming. A world where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, where reality itself was as fluid as the ocean depths, and where the dreams of ancient beings from beyond space and time would reshape everything they had ever known or believed to be true.